One of the important and for many readers very memorable characters of Ursula K. Leguin's fourth Earthsea novel, Tehanu, is Aunty Moss. And Moss is a village witch, a woman of some power, and somebody who is going to become closely connected with Tenar and her adopted daughter Theru, and with Ged, also connected with Ogion since they live in the same place. And Moss views him as, by contrast to so many other mages and wizards, a very kind and gentle man, somebody who's good and treats her well. So what is a village witch? We should start there, and there's a description that's provided in this. Village witches, though they may know many spells and charms in some of the great songs, were never trained in the high arts or principles of magery. No woman was so trained. Wizardry was a man's work, a man's skill. Magic was made by men, and in this book we find out there had never been a woman mage, though some few had called themselves wizard or sorceress. Their power had been untrained, strength without outer knowledge, half frivolous, half dangerous. Now, we know from the later stories and novels that that's not quite true, and there was also an enchantress at Rayalby just up the road, but witches are a pretty common phenomenon across not just the Isle of Gaunt, but Earthsea. And Leguin continues and says, the ordinary village witch, like Moss, lived on a few words of the true speech handed down as great treasures from older witches or bought at high cost from sorcerers, and a supply of common spells of finding and mending, much meaningless ritual and mystery-making and gibberish, a solid experiential training in midwifery, bone-setting, curing animal and human ailments, a good knowledge of herbs mixed with a mess of superstitions, all this built up on whatever native gift she might have of healing, chanting, changing, or spellcasting. Such a mixture might be a good one or a bad one. Some witches were fierce, bitter women, ready to do harm, knowing no reason not to do harm. Most were midwives and healers with a few love potions, fertility charms, and potency spells on the side, and a good deal of quiet cynicism about them. A few having wisdom, though no learning, used their gift purely for good, though they could not tell, as any apprentice wizard could, the reason for what they did, and prate of the balance and the way of power to justify their abstention or action. And so this is, an interesting starting point for thinking about what these village witches are. We know, of them already from A Wizard of Earthsea, where Ged's aunt was a witch and taught him a number of names, and then he winds up being apprenticed to Ogion. And there's also a backstory, an important backstory, at least for Moss, about how she wound up in the village, because she wasn't actually from there. And this comes up while she and Tenar are discussing wizardry and sexuality and things that we're going to get to in a bit. And here's the description. Moss says, I was crazy for a man here for a long time ago, a good-looking man, but a cold, hard heart. But I was so heart-set on him, I did use my art. I spent many a charm on him, but it was all wasted. I came up here to Rayalby in the first place when I was a girl because I was in trouble with a man in Gauntport. But I can't talk of that, for they were rich, great folks. 'Twas they that had the power, not I. They didn't want their son tangled with a common girl like me, foul slut they called me, and they'd have had me put out of the way like killing a cat if I hadn't run off up here. But I did like that lad with his round, smooth arms and legs and his big dark eyes. I can see him plain as plain after all these years. So she was, a local girl in Gauntport, already probably a witch. She had some power, got involved with a man from a rich family. They didn't like that. They threatened to kill her, probably a baby as well. And she goes on up to Rayalby, doesn't go to the manor house, of course, but just to the village, and that's where she stays. We also find out that Tenar had encountered Moss quite a long time ago, when Tenar had first lived in Rayalby 25 years ago, Moss had not been an old witch, but a young one. She had ducked and bowed and grinned at the young lady, the white lady, Ogion's ward and student, never speaking to her but with the utmost respect. Tenar had felt that respect to be false, a mask for an envy and dislike and distrust that were all too familiar to her from women over whom she'd been placed in a position of superiority, women who saw themselves as common and her as uncommon, as privileged. Priestess of the tombs of Atuan or foreign ward of the mage of Gaunt, she was set apart, set above. Men had given her power. Men had shared their power with her. Women looked at her from outside, sometimes rivalrous, often with a trace of ridicule. She'd felt herself to be the one left outside, shut out. And so, Moss was part of that as well. Moss fit in better, as much as a witch can fit in. And so that's, a good backstory and sort of thumbnail sketch of what witches are like. Now, Moss is going to be a very helpful person, in her own ways, of course. She's going to help Tenar with Ogion, with Theru, and with Ged in important ways. And she'll also communicate what she has of her own wisdom to Tenar. So first, Ogion dies, and Moss is the one, as village witches are accustomed to do, who handles his what's called homing. And there's a description of it here, brief one. Aunty Moss, unmarried like most witches, unwashed, with graying hair tied in curious charm knots, eyes red-rimmed from herb smoke. She had come across the meadow with the lantern, and with Tenar and the others she'd watched the night by Ogion's body. This is the homing. She'd set a wax candle in a glass shade there in the forest and burned sweet oils in a dish of clay. She said the words that should be said and done what should be done. When it came to touching the body to prepare it for burial, she looked at once to Tenar as if for permission and then gone on with her offices. Village witches usually saw to the homing, as they called it, of the dead and often to the burial. Then the two wizards come, one from the manor house and one from the port of Gaunt, and they're both basically trying to take over the ceremony. And Tenar says, I was the one who was his ward. I know that he wants to be buried here. I'm the one who actually knows his name, and they're not paying attention to her because she's a woman. And then Moss, who's scurried away when the wizards show up, actually interrupts them, saying loudly, yes, she was. She was, nobody else but her. He sent for her. He sent young Townsend, the sheep dealer, to tell her to come clear around the mountain. And he waited his dying till she did come and was with him. Then he died, and he died where he would be buried, here. So Moss is sticking up for Ogion and for Tenar. And with Theru, there's something else that's going on. And I'm going to actually read another line. This is quite important. Since she and Moss kept the vigil for Ogion together, the witch had made it plain she would be Tenar's friend, follower, servant, whatever Tenar wanted her to be. Tenar was not at all sure what she wanted Aunty Moss to be, finding her unpredictable, unreliable, incomprehensible, passionate, ignorant, sly, and dirty. But Moss got on with the burned child. Perhaps it was Moss who is working this change, this slight easing in Theru. With her, Theru behaved as with everyone, blank, unanswering, docile in the way an inanimate thing, a stone, is docile. But the old woman had kept at her, offering her little sweets and treasures, bribing, coaxing, wheedling. Come with Aunty Moss now, dearie. Come along and Aunty Moss will show you the prettiest sight you ever saw. And Tenar reflects that, in the stories about witches, this might lead to being in an oven or something like that. But in the case of Theru, Moss is actually showing her all sorts of things. She's educating her in her environment and in what she can do with her body. A prime example of this is where it says, nothing Theru did or said showed she was learning anything from Aunty Moss except where the lark nested and the blueberries grew and how to make cat's cradles one-handed. Theru's right hand had been so eaten by fire it had healed into a kind of club, the thumb usable only as a pincer like a crab's claw. But Aunty Moss had an amazing set of cat's cradles for 4 fingers and a thumb, and rhymes to go with the figures. Churn, churn, cherry all, burn, burn, berry all, come, dragon, come. And the string would form 4 triangles that flicked into a square. So, Cat's Cradle, of course, is the child's game where you have a string and you make different figures with it. Moss is helping Theru to develop, to grow in a way that maybe Tenar can't completely do herself. Another line, she was kind to Theru, but it was a wheedling kindness. And when they were together, it seems she talked to the child a great deal. Tenar did not know what Moss was telling her, teaching her, whether she should let the witch fill the child's head with stuff. And they bring up this very important line, weak as woman's magic, wicked as woman's magic, she'd heard 100 times. So, maybe there's something bad going on, maybe there's something good going on. When it comes to Ged, after Tenar has him delivered to her by Khaleesian, the oldest of all dragons, and she brings Ged down, she needs some help, and Aunty Moss and Heather help her get Ged, who seems to be perhaps dying, into Ogion's bed, and they nurse and tend him there. And Moss is on the alert. She says, this isn't the same guy. He doesn't have any wizardly powers. He's not a mage at all. So be on guard. Maybe he's a Gebeth. Maybe he's a trickster. We don't know what's going on. And Moss actually kind of hopes that he's going to die, but he doesn't die. Later, Moss will actually offer Ged sanctuary in her place when Ged is trying to hide from the king's men who are wanting to bring him as the archmage, which he no longer feels himself to be, to the king. And Moss will also send him on his way when he goes south to become a goat herder once again with some bread and some cheese, some provisions for the road. Tenar sees the effects of all of this, and she and Moss have a important friendship that develops. And they have some very interesting conversations in which Tenar is going to learn something, and Moss is very convinced of her point of view. She's putting forth something. Leguin is having Moss as a character say some things that are very attractive to some people when it comes to all these key topics of witches and wizards, magic, power, and sexuality. But it's not actually representative of Leguin's position as much as Tenar's point of view is. And so, we get some important teachings. Here's one. Tenar says, Aunty, how do you tell if a man's a wizard or not? Moss's reply was circuitous, beginning with the usual nomics and obscurities. Deep knows deep, she said deeply, and what's born will speak. And she told a story about an ant that picked up a tiny end of hair from the floor of a palace and ran off to the ant's nest with it. And in the night, the nest glowed underground like a star, for the hair was from the head of the great mage Brost. But only the wise could see the glowing anthill. To common eyes, it was dark. One needs training then, said Tenar. Maybe, maybe not, was the gist of Moss's dark reply. Some are born with that gift. Even when they don't know it, it will be there like the hair of the mage in the hole in the ground. It will shine. And then she says, well, how do you know if a man's not a wizard? And she says, it's not there. It's not there, dearie, the power. If I've got eyes in my head, I can see that you have eyes, right? If you're blind, I'll see that. If you've only got one eye, or like the little one, or if you've got 3, I'll see them, won't I? But if I don't have an eye to see with, I won't know till you do tell me. But I do. I see. I know. The third eye, she touched her forehead and gave a loud, dry chuckle. She was pleased with having found the words to say what she wanted to say. A good deal of her obscurity and cant, Tenar began to realize, was mere ineptness with words and ideas. Nobody had ever taught her to think consecutively. Nobody had ever listened to what was said. All that was expected, all that was wanted of her was muddled mystery mumbling. She was a witch woman. She had nothing to do with clear meaning. And so, she goes on and they talk about power and wizardry. And then Moss says something very interesting. She says, the best I can say is like this about men. A man's in his skin, see, like a nut in its shell. It's hard and strong, that shell, and it's all full of him, full of grand man meat, man self. And that's all. That's all there is. It's all him and nothing else inside. Tenar pondered a while and said, but if he's a wizard, then it's all his power inside. His power is himself. See, that's how it is with him, and that's all. When his power is gone, he's gone. Empty. Nothing. And a woman then? And here's where Moss says one of the lines that has been repeated so many times about this book. Oh, well, dearie, a woman's a different thing entirely. Who knows where a woman begins and ends? Listen, mistress, I have roots. I have roots deeper than this island, deeper than the sea, older than the raising of the lands. I go back into the dark. Moss's eyes shone with a weird brightness in their red rims, and her voice sang like an instrument. I go back into the dark. Before the moon I was. No one knows. No one knows. No one can say what I am, what a woman is, a woman of power, a woman's power, deeper than the roots of trees, deeper than the roots of islands, older than the making, older than the moon. Who dares ask questions of the dark? Who'll ask the dark its name? The old woman was rocking, chanting, lost in her incantation. But Tenar sat upright. I will. I've lived long enough in the dark. And so what we have here is Moss putting forth this, very, in some respects, grandiose view of what it is to be a woman. Roots that go down forever into the dark and can't be brought into the light as a result. A little bit later, when she's talking about wizards and witches again, and she's talking about power, she will tell us that a wizard is like a great, pine tree, something very visible, but it can get blown down. Whereas a witch, women in general, are like blackberry thickets. Their roots are not going to be pulled up by any wind whatsoever. They don't go as high, and they may have thorns rather than needles, but they're much more durable. There's also some interesting discussions, as we've already mentioned, about sexuality. And Moss is very interested in Tenar's account of the eunuchs, right? She asked, do they take him and do him like rams and he-goats, like that, with a gelding knife? Horror, the macabre, and a gleam of vengeance had won out over both anger and reason. Moss didn't want to pursue any topic but that of eunuchs. Tenar could not tell her much. She realized she'd never thought about the matter when she was a girl in Ogion. There'd been gelded men, and one of them had loved her tenderly, and she him, and she'd killed him to escape from him. Then she'd come to the archipelago where there were no eunuchs, and forgotten them, sunk them in darkness with Manon's body. And a little bit later, they also talk about, we come back to the sexuality part as well. And here we go. So Moss, talking about Ged, says, it's a queer thing for an old man to be a boy of 15, no doubt. Tenar also almost said, what are you talking about, Moss? Something prevented her. She realized she'd been listening for Ged to come back. Ah, she said, a great many thoughts suddenly coming to her mind all at once. That's why, she said, that's why I never. After a long silence, she said, do wizards, is it a spell? Surely, dearie, said Moss. They witch themselves. Some will tell you they make a trade-off like marriage turned backward with vows and all, and so get their power then. But to me, that's got a wrong sound to it, like a dealing with the old powers more than what a true witch deals with. And the old mage, he told me they did no such thing, though I have known some women witches do it and come to no great harm by it. The ones who brought me up, Tenar says, did that promising virginity. Oh, aye, no men, you told me, and them eunuchs, terrible. But why did I never think? And then the witch says, because that's the power of them, dearie. You don't think, you can't. And nor do they once they've set their spell. How could they? Given their power, it wouldn't do. You don't get without you give as much. That's true for all. So they know, the witch men, the men of power, they know that better than any. But it's an uneasy thing for a man not to be a man, no matter if he can call the sun down from the sky. And so they put it right out of mind with their spells of binding. And truly so. I've never heard of a wizard breaking these spells, seeking to use his power for his body's lust. Even the worst would fear to. And Tenar says, they set themselves apart. Aye, a wizard has to do that. But you don't. Me, I'm only a witch woman, dearie. And she says, but you haven't been celibate. What's that, dearie? Like the wizards? Oh, no, no, no. Never was anything to look at, but there was a way I could look at them. Not witching, dearie, but you know what I mean. There's a way to look, and he'd come around, sure as a crow will caw. I knew what it was they needed if I liked them well enough. Maybe they got it. As for love, I'm not one of them, though some witches are, but they dishonor the art. I do my art for pay, but I take my pleasure for love. So women of power don't have to be celibate. Men of power have to give up their sexuality, and that's what Ged in fact did. And that's why Tenar realizes they never became, as we would say, an item. The last thing that we have to talk about is that moss is used by the wicked wizard Aspen of Re Albi as bait to try to lure Tenar and Theru. He actually ends up getting Ged in. And what we find is Theru runs to Aunty Moss, and she says, "Who's there? Who's there? Oh, dearie, my little burned one, my pretty, what are you doing here? Where's your mother? Did she come? Don't come in, dearie. There's a curse on me. He cursed the old woman. Don't come near me." Theru puts out her hand and touches her. And she says, "Don't look at me. He made my flesh rot and shrivel and rot again, but he won't let me die. He said I'd bring you here. I tried to die. I tried, but he held me. He held me living against my will. He won't let me die." Theru says, "You shouldn't die." And she says, "Child," the old woman whispered, "dearie, call me by my name." "Hatha," the child said. "Ah, I knew. Set me free, dearie." And Theru says, "I have to wait till they come." "Till who come, dearie?" "My people." The witch's big cold hand lay like a bundle of sticks in hers. She held it firmly. It was dark now. Outside the hut as in it, Hatha, who was called Moss, slept. And presently the child sitting on the floor beside her cot with a hen perched nearby slept also. So Theru now is able to return the care and the nursing that Moss has given to her. And in the end, Moss will be saved, fortunately. There's more to be told to the story. But this is enough about, I think, this important character, Aunty Moss, who represents a certain way of understanding all of these important topics, the relation between men and women, magic and power, and sexuality, and good and evil.